I'm Tim Ventura from AmericanAntiGravity.com, and I'm speaking today with Al Bielek, a participant in both the Philadelphia experiment and later the Montauk Project. The topic of today's discussion is Al's experiences in the future.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Well, we're here today to talk about the future. We had done an interview a few months ago, and at the end of that, I really came away from it feeling like you'd had experiences after Montauk or during Montauk where you'd been transported to the future, and I was never able to really cover those. So I'm really glad to be able to speak with you again about this and hopefully learn a little bit more about what the future looks like.
Okay.
Well, what can you tell me about, in the Montauk experiment, you were transported forward in time, right?
That was, they were doing several things at Montauk. It started out basically, in fact, throughout the whole period, it was basically German scientists there continuing their research, which started in Nazi Germany, and when, of course, they lost the war, there was a little operation called Operation Paperclip to bring many of those scientists and personnel into the U.S., totally bypassed Nuremberg war trials, and they wound up initially at Brookhaven National Laboratories, and after about 20 years worth of research there from roughly 1947 to 1967, being that Brookhaven was basically a national laboratory supported by tax monies, they had to make reports every 30 days to the cognizant authorities and down in Congress and the Senate as to what they were doing and what the money was being spent for. They were working at Brookhaven on time travel and mind control and a number of things. And eventually those reports were bypassed for a long period of time, but eventually somebody started reading them. And when they started reading them, it says, mind control? They may try to use this on us. Stop the funding and pull the project and get those guys out of there. Well, I don't know whether they saw this coming in advance or not, but they looked around for another place to continue their work, and they found it not far away, a little further east on the island. Because Brookhaven's about mid-island of Long Island, and out on the extreme eastern tip was this operation. Then was strictly Air Force, long-range radar testing. First, I've forgotten the name of the earlier project, but then the later on project was BMUS. SAGE was the early one. Over-the-horizon radar, very high-powered stuff. And, of course, when the Air Force finished their testing in about 1968-69, they closed up shop, pretty much abandoned the base, and Army personnel was still there, whom these scientists from Brookhaven talked to, and they told him, he says, basically, in their next war, how would you like to be able to push a button and have all of your enemies fall over? You don't have to go to bomb them or anything else, they'll just fold up. Well, they liked the idea, and they said, we can continue, we're doing research in this direction. We can continue the research if you give us another place to continue our work, because we're being thrown out of where we are. So the Army personnel liked it, and the other military personnel liked it, and apparently the Pentagon or whomever was cognizant in Washington went along with it, so they got moved out there to Montauk, took over a base which was in the process of being abandoned, with all of their equipment still there. They took it over, and all of the underground operations, of which there were then about at least 6, possibly 8 levels, and the tunnels under Long Island, under the surface, that is, stretched for miles and miles and miles, and they had plenty of space to expand their operations. So they moved in and took over and continued their work, which was not only mind control, which gave rise to the Montauk Boys Project, but it was also in time travel, doing experimental work with time. And then, of course, in came the alien groups, thanks to the government, who sponsored them and said, these guys may be able to help you. And the Germans were not unfamiliar with aliens, because back in the days before World War II started, and even for some time afterwards, Germany was invaded with large numbers of UFOs and alien ships and personnel that came down to the surface and swept up everything they could find, from military vehicles with military personnel in them to people to whatever. So they were not unfamiliar with the alien problem. But these guys were sponsored by the U.S. government to work with them. And they came out and part of the project, and they said, well, we can help you to do certain things. They said, you know how to do time travel, but you don't know how to create a wormhole through space and time simultaneously. We can show you how to do that. So that was agreed to by the government and agreed to by the personnel out of Montauk, namely the German scientists running the project. And they moved in the alien groups and their scientists and technicians. Eventually, they developed by 1975-76 the Montauk Tunnel, as it became known, which was literally a tunnel to go through space and time theoretically, anywheres in the universe. As a practical matter, anywheres in our galaxy, and eventually outside. It was a very easy matter with the Montauk Tunnel to take a trip and send personnel to Mars.
Well, Al, if I could interject for just a sec, I have an acquaintance named Bruce Smith, and I was telling Bruce about our earlier interview, and one of the things that he had mentioned was he'd actually gone out to Montauk to visit, and he said, just from his survey of the place, that it is the strangest place he's ever been in terms of structures, at least. I guess all the pipes are above ground. And a lot of pipes above ground. They originally had a power station which was torn down before the last demise of the project, and almost everything was underground. And when the Air Force was there from 1991, I think it was, onward to 98 with Operation Sky Pebbles, they took everything over. Preston Nichols was part of that project officially, and he remembers a great deal about it, but they had most of their operations underground. Almost everything was underground after the collapse in first 83 to 87, then was resurrected by the German group in 87 and went on to about 91 when the Air Force took over. And then the German scientists were, I don't know personally, but I think were largely removed and pushed on the outside while the Air Force took over with its personnel. The work that the Air Force did, very briefly, was in terms of producing a very high-powered particle beam weapon system, which they were very successful at. And that was aimed at deflecting a little comet called Hale-Bopp, which was closing in on Earth at about 1997-98. They had to deflect it because they had it aimed directly at Earth, regardless of what the original trajectories indicated. It was aimed straight at Earth, and every time they deflected it and changed its course, it was straightened out and heading again straight towards Earth. Well, eventually they were able to deflect it and control it sufficiently so it passed safely around the Earth is known history. But what it took to do that wasn't quite unbelievable, because there's an object behind the Hale-Bopp comet which was steering it. The fear about Hale-Bopp was the fact that it had a huge corona around it of very noxious gases, which if they, like chlorine, like methane and so forth, if they were to mix in large amount with Earth's atmosphere, would poison virtually everything from plant life to animal life. So they had to get this thing around and not go down a collision course or even a near miss, which they did do successfully. But prior to that, of course, this whole operation was dedicated as Montauk to the German scientists' use, in which they created the Montauk tunnels and they created some time travel work and experiments. One of the higher level engineers who was involved in the time travel work there, he's a good friend of mine and still keep in touch with him. And this basically what was going on. The other thing, of course, the Montauk Boys Project was primarily concerned with mind control, using young boys. Now, they had to use boys at that time because they hadn't developed the technology far enough to be able to interface directly with the brain, in which case when we interface directly with the brain, you could use male or female, because male or female brains are essentially the same. But the chakra system in the human body is not identical between the male and female. It's reversed. In the male, the number 1 chakra is a sex chakra, and the female, the number 2 chakra is a sex chakra. And it's that way for a reason.
But when you're trying to do mind control, it becomes very inconvenient. You could not access the females.
Sure.
Where you could access the males. Until they came along in late 97, early 98 with a new system whereby they finally were able, with enough advanced technology, find out how to access the brain centers in the subconscious mind directly, whereupon you could bypass the use of all of the hardware and devices and the crude systems back in the, let's say, in the early mid-80s, where they had to access the boys only directly in a physical manner. Then it got off to EEG machines modified to access through the very sensitive areas of the body by pads and probes which were fed back to the machine, and they could access the human subconscious, and then at a certain point they would be given instructions as to what they would remember, what they would do on future command, and so forth. That was a major part of the Montauk program. It was the Montauk Boys program. It's still ongoing. It's not there anymore. Every major city in the U.S. has a Montauk Boys training program. Every major city in the U.S.
Well, once these boys or individuals are fully trained, they're able to control the Montauk equipment, right? And
I'm sorry, they're what?
Oh, well, once they're fully trained, they're able to control the Montauk equipment, right?
They're training them for mind control in the sense that they can be accessed by radio control, by telephone command, accessing a certain prearranged code to do certain things which they may have been pre-trained for, like to be a saboteur, start fires, gather information, be a spy, whatever. This could all be implanted in advance and push a button which accesses a radio transmitter, and Preston proved that the radio transmitters, standard radio transmitters, could access the human brain and where the person had been pre-programmed and get them to call up, give them the communication, call, if you hear this message, call such and such phone number. At least set up a dummy phone number to see if this would work, and found out in 3 days they got over 600 phone calls from all over the eastern seaboard of the U.S.
Sure.
He proved that the system worked. But of course, eventually, they wanted to use them in various capacities, and the other side of this was, if they weren't pre-programmed in advance, they were preconditioned in advance for programming, which could be done on the spot when they would be called in for the, let us say, quote, the final instructions, unquote. Well, the problem is today that this program has been expanded to the point where virtually no human male or female at the right age, which is typically around puberty to about the age of 15, 16, that is the most susceptible range time-wise for a young man or a young woman to be programmed. They're most accessible, they're most susceptible. After 17, they're no longer susceptible. They start to develop their own personality and mindset, and it becomes much more difficult to program a person. It can be done, but it's more difficult. And this was the primary product of Montauk, and then later on in these other locations in the U.S. And the problem now is that so many kids, I would say as a rounded number, 90% of the youth of this country have been programmed.
It's pretty substantial.
You go abroad in Europe, it's less than 30. You go to a place like Australia, maybe 1% or 2%. A few of those Australians were pulled in over to the U.S. to go through the U.S. programs. But the U.S. has always been the prime target for control, mind control. And of course, these kids grow up, go to school, get a job, whatever, and they're sitting ducks for mind control and manipulation inside of a corporation. They can manipulate those companies if they're in sensitive positions, and most of them wind up sooner or later in a sensitive position.
Yeah.
So this is part of what was going on. Other aspects of time travel, going into the future, going to Mars to find out what was there, and that's a long story. Basically, we sent more than one team to Mars because of the fact that we had sent set up colonies on Mars from about 1969 onward. Now that date may shock you, but we have had very valid transport systems, quite aside from Montauk, where you could, with large spaceships, which we have, you could take people up to Mars and establish a colony, a human colony on the surface under a dome. Eventually, they found out that there were underground constructions. I mean, the colonists found this, and they radioed back to Earth. We don't have Earth-moving machinery to open up these obvious closures of entrances. What do? He says, well, give us a coordinate of the location on the surface of the planet, and we'll explore it from Earth via Montauk. They said, well, what we can do is send a camera in there, and if you're correct, there's an underground cavern, we'll be able to film it. If you're wrong and it's solid rock, all we'll do is lose a camera. So they did this and found an extensive cavern system, which was underground Mars, and eventually they sent more than cameras, they sent crews for exploration. And I was on one of those crews, and excuse me, so was my brother Duncan. And we went several times, and we decided, because we knew the guy who was in charge of the equipment, we wanted to go exploring on our own, just the two of us. So we did. We made 2 trips, and on the return from the second trip, they were waiting for us. They said, you're not going there anymore, we're breaking a little friendly team up, you're going to continue work with other areas and so forth. Of course, they continued exploring the underground of Mars thereafter. And what finally happened, they found out it was very extensive, intact cities, complete with power systems and everything else, which you're able to access and turn back on. So the United States Navy took it over. They moved up to Mars with a huge operation. A friend of mine was there for 20 years under aegis of the United States Navy, and he has written about it. It's on the internet under the name of the Mars Records. Anyone who wants to look it up, they can find it.
Oh, okay.
It's published in printed form and also CD form. And he was brainwashed very heavily. When he came back, he didn't remember what had happened. I mean, he knew something had happened. And I ran into him one of the Global Scientist Congresses and told him some things. And I said, it looks like you have been very heavily programmed, so you need somebody to help deprogram you and recover your memories. Well, eventually, someone did. His lady friend, who became later his wife, they went over to Australia. She had lots of friends over there, and he went over with her. And there was a whole group, a coterie of people there who were into the mind control and the deprogramming aspect. He was largely deprogrammed. I can't say 100%. I don't know, but he was heavily deprogrammed and recovered his memories and published on it. And it's one unbelievable story of manipulation of personnel, Navy personnel. The Navy uses as a major base for, let us say, many operations. I don't want to spoil the story for those who might want to get the CD and get it off the net and then get it straight from Michael. But these are some of the things that were going on, and it's quite unbelievable. The general public has not the foggiest notion of how far advanced our technology is. We have huge spaceships, which the first one that was built and completed and commissioned in 1986 for a really large one for us to travel outside of our galaxy. And the Navy, of course, has charge of them, but it's completely undercover. And this has been written about in certain channels, and the guy who published on this with the information wound up having a, shall we say, a car accident. He was riding his bicycle to work one day and up in Utah, and he got hit by a car. He wound up in the hospital. He survived, but he got the message. There's no more publication and hardly any more talking. Some people don't get the message soon enough, or they're treading on dangerous grounds, and if they want to, that's at their risk. I'm not saying they shouldn't, but you better weigh your alternatives. Do you want to take the risk and get the information out to the public, if the public will believe it in the first place, or convince them of what's going on? You better get your immunity and your protection set up well in advance.
Well,
talk about certain of these subjects, you'll be in very dangerous territory.
Yeah, one of the things that you had mentioned, and I believe this goes way back to even your Art Bell interview in the early 90s, but you described going far forward in time also, several thousand years ahead.
I'm sorry, I described what?
Oh, you described going several thousand years ahead in time.
Yes.
And I was hoping to learn a little bit more about, how do things look once you get past our local time area, once you go out?
Not good. The information I had, what happened was that when Duncan and I jumped off the ship, which we have since called the Eldridge, it wasn't the Eldridge, but nevertheless, we jumped overboard and we expected to hit the water and swim ashore. Instead, we fell through some kind of a time tunnel and wound up being badly burned by radiation out in space as we jumped overboard with our standard clothes and no radiation-proof suits. So we wound up in a hospital in the year 2137. And from that vantage point, watching TV, they still had TV and they still had hospitals and technicians, but that's when we found out that the world population had taken a terrible beating. There were some very serious problems that developed between the year 2009 roughly and 2025. In that period of time, the world population dropped from its present 7 billion approximate to approximately 250 million worldwide.
Wow. Now, did you ever find out what the disaster is supposed to be that causes this?
Well, it wasn't due to natural disasters. They occurred, yes, but the population drop was due to and unknown factors, which were basically considered disease, and people started dropping dead all over the place in the streets for the hundreds of thousands. And it became a problem nobody could cope with. Well, when enough people were dead, the infrastructure collapses because there's nobody left to run anything.
Sure.
And that's what happened. The military wound up being the viable force which had to run everything, and not only in the United States but worldwide. And we had natural disasters on the West Coast, some on the East Coast. The geography changed. I saw that from the TV shows, and I asked for maps, and they showed me what had happened. There were severe problems, not so severe on the East Coast as on the West Coast. The West Coast has, of course, the San Andreas Fault, which creates a fissure where it enters the landmass between roughly San Francisco and San Jose. And then comes inland, it goes down Central Valley, and goes all the way down to the lower California, Baja, and comes out in the Gulf, the lower Gulf. And where it comes in is where you're going to have the trouble. It doesn't mean everything west of the fault is going to disappear. That doesn't happen. What does happen, a lot of it does disappear. Los Angeles had severe damage. North of LA had severe damage. Most of the peninsula of San Francisco survived. The city of San Francisco survived more or less. And when you're down to LA, a good part of it survived, particularly the hill country and also downtown Los Angeles, which of course was built on hill structure, heavy rock. The downtown skyscrapers survived. But when you go into Hollywood and the other areas, which were lower territory, and particularly the beaches all disappeared. The cliff dwellings disappeared. Some of the more wealthy areas like Beverly Hills, which are up in the hills, survived, but not without damage. The earthquake damage was not that severe there. It was mostly, there was earthquake damage coupled with seawater. The East Coast was hurt more by, shall we say, the intrusion of the sea. Atlanta today is about 90 miles inland from the coast. It winds up being a port city, 3 miles from the coast.
That's pretty substantial.
That's rather substantial. It survived. The city as a whole survived. They had fire damage. They had other problems. And of course, the big problem was the loss of population. How do you handle that? Well, over a period of a long time, going on into the future, into the 28th century, they started the rebuilding process roughly from 2025 on, but it took a century and a half to make any real progress in rebuilding cities and the infrastructure and so forth. And of course, the Great Lakes disappeared. The Mississippi River became an inland seaway. At its narrowest point, below where Chicago had been, I'm speaking, of course, in future terms, the narrowest point was 30 miles wide, and they built a suspension bridge over that to maintain communication between the east and the west. 30-mile-long bridge, that's one hell of an accomplishment. But they did it and reestablished rail, communications, roads, and so forth. There was, for a long time, there was very little, shall we say, personal travel. It was mostly industrial, commercial, business, and so forth. Airline service like we know it today just totally disappeared. The rail service was first to be reestablished, and the highways were rebuilt so they could have truck traffic hauling supplies, and the United States disappeared as a nation. It became, for reference, in 2137, they still referred to the individual states as they had been, but all of the structures changed. It became a continent of city-states. In other words, each city was a state unto itself.
Sure.
Whether it was an old city or a new one that was built. And they were all run individually on that basis. Now, after about the 25th century, research into various areas, of course, did not die. They finally developed artificial intelligence computers. And they established a system of artificial intelligence computers, one per city, to run the city and to take care of all of the legal aspects, enforcement aspects, infrastructure of about every conceivable nature. There were no more police. It was the police. There were no more courts. It was the court. Libraries and all that still exist. People continue to live like they do today, except the, shall we say, the sexual mores were far more open in the future than they are now, even with all the arguments we have now about gay marriages and all of that. Individual rights became much more accepted, and of course you had legal guidelines, what you were to stay within. And it became a totally socialistic government, a totally socialistic structure, 100% socialism. The family was given, or the people who decided they wanted to have a family, or were working already, were given their own apartments. Of course, it was owned by the state, such as the Russian communist experiment. And they were given a free education to whatever level they could sustain, including up to PhD. And they were expected then to go to work and repay society for the debt that had been engaged by their education and survival to that point. And most everybody went along with this. They agreed with it. There were a few mavericks who didn't, and they were told, well, if you don't like the system, you're free to leave any time. We're not going to throw you in jail. You can go live out in the boonies if you want to, by yourself. And some chose to do so. But the socialistic structure eventually became a trap, because what happens under pure socialism, where everything is given to you, and of course, if you go to work, you establish a sort of bank account. It was a credit account. There was no money circulating as such anymore, in which you were given credit for what work you had done, and you have a credit account you could draw against, and so on. But the problem is, without the incentive for a capitalist society, without the incentive for someone to go out and build a better mousetrap, the better TV set, the better car, whatever it may be, without that incentive, the creativity dies. And after a while, you're just maintaining your society by rote, by repeating what you've been told to do. And there's no thought about creating something new or something better or something different.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That became the problem in going beyond the 28th century. Those who were controlling the whole business from behind the scenes realized this, and they didn't know exactly what to do at that point, but they were sure contemplating it and realizing they had to go back into the past and make some corrections to what they had accepted as in the initial thinking of perhaps the best way for society to go in terms of the best good for the most people. And plus the ones who were in back of this, as I found out eventually, were the wingmakers. They were the ones, the power behind the throne being, of course, the artificial intelligence computers, which were on a complete national network and were all subject to monitoring. And if they violated their own rules, and one of the cardinal rules was that these intelligence computers never lie to anyone for any reason. If one was ever caught doing it, it was removed and replaced. And I presume scrapped, I don't know. But that was one cardinal concern, that these intelligent computers, artificial intelligence computers, must use the line themselves. And they were given the guidelines of what they were to do, and they usually followed it very well. If a criminal turned up committing a felony, like, say, a murder or something like that, they were pulled into the chamber where these things lived, so to speak. When I say lived, it's an artificial intelligence thing, but it was in a highly radioactive crystal form, and you had to go in there with radioactive protection on you when you went in the chamber. Otherwise, the radiation could kill you in a few minutes. So with that protective clothing, you go in there, and it would interrogate you mentally. The things were telepathic. And it would determine very quickly what the facts were, as to whether you were guilty as charged, or whether you were innocent, or whether it was complicity, or whatever, and mete out a sentence accordingly. If it was a minor infraction, you'd be sent off to a equivalent of a work camp. If it was a major infraction, like not just an infraction, but let's say you had committed a major crime, you never left the chamber. Whoever was guilty, they were vaporized on the spot.
On that note, we're going to take a break. This is the end of part 1 of Al Bielek in the Future.